classes. I think that you'll leave this afternoon convinced that you have been really, really blessed by being here, because we have 4 people to present that are highly qualified to deal with the most important issue of all, that is human relationships, as we speak of human rights or civil rights. The format will be one in which 2 of our guests will do a presentation from the podium. Those presentations are about 18 or 20 minutes each. Then they'll move the screen, and they will come to the stage with 2 other people, and there'll be a panel, and our other 2 people will be responding to their presentation, and very importantly, opening up to you for questions following these presentations. Our first guest will be using some visuals, and that's why we've made this arrangement as it is. Let me introduce the 2 keynote speakers, and then I'll introduce the panel when we get to that point. One from Canada and one from the United States. First of all, let me welcome to our city and to our state and to the United States, Cassie Palamar. She comes to us from Calgary in Canada. She is with the Education and Commission Services, or manager of that, for the Alberta Human Rights and Citizenship Commission in Calgary, Alberta. Since joining the Alberta Human Rights and Citizenship Commission in 1994, Palamar has held a number of very senior positions within the Commission, including Assistant Director and Regional Manager. She is a member of the Commission's management team and is responsible for the areas of education and Commission services. She and her colleagues provide advice, referrals, and consultation, along with building partnerships and collaboration, development information, and educational resources, and offer programs that foster equality, strengthen inclusion in the workplace and in communities, and support the reduction of discrimination for all Alberta citizens. Welcome to our country. We're delighted to have you here. Let's give a welcome to our guests. Our second guest is from the United States, from Boise, Idaho, and I think we go back for over 20 years in our work in human rights. We welcome to Coeur d'Alene from Boise, Leslie Goddard. She is now presently the Executive Director of the Idaho Human Rights Commission. Goddard served for several years as the legal counsel to the Idaho Human Rights Commission when Marilyn Schuler was the Executive Director. In the mid-1990s, she was appointed by Governor Phil Batt to serve as Executive Director of that commission. She and the Commission are charged with the application of state policies embodied in the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964. Our agency works to secure freedom from discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin, or sex for all Idaho citizens. The Commission investigates complaints by any person claiming to be discriminated against in those categories. Let us welcome our good friend, Leslie Goddard. Bring to the platform for her presentation, Cassie Palamar.
Thanks very much, Tony. I appreciate that. A very warm welcome. I'm going to spend just a few minutes today introducing you to the Human Rights Commission and the legislation in Alberta. I want to tell you a little bit about the perspectives of Albertans about human rights. I want to talk about the outcomes we're looking to achieve and some of our key areas of work, the first resolving and adjudicating human rights complaints, and the second being education and promotion initiatives. And finally, I want to share one of our awareness initiatives with you, which is a television media campaign. In Canada, each province and territory and the federal government each have their own human rights legislation. The provincial, territorial acts, and the federal act are mutually exclusive. So that is, one is not superior to the other legislation. They simply apply to different jurisdictions. In Alberta, 80 to 90% of the activities in Alberta fall under provincial legislation rather than federal legislation. Alberta's legislation begins with a preamble that speaks to the province's human rights values and principles. This is primacy legislation. It takes precedence over all other provincial statutes unless a statute says that it specifically operates notwithstanding that legislation. And to date, there is no legislation in Alberta Act establishes the Commission as a separate, neutral, and independent body from the government. It identifies the areas or activities in which discrimination is prohibited, as well as the grounds or types of specific discrimination that are prohibited. It outlines how the legislation is enforced and the Commission's educational responsibilities, and as I said, those are two of the key areas I'll talk about. In the 1970s, the model used to advance human rights protection was similar to most other government regulatory programs, namely an enforcement model with sanctions for non-compliance. Over time, however, we've been shifting to more of a social justice and educational and problem-solving approach. And I just want to quote Dr. Daniel Hill, former chair of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and this is him talking about the transformation over the past 50 years from quasi-criminal statutes that were largely ineffective to a more modern-day blend of education, conciliation, and legal approaches that have proven more successful. This is Dr. Hill saying, modern-day human rights legislation is predicated on the theory that the actions of prejudiced people and their attitudes can be changed and influenced by the process of re-education, discussion, and the presentation of dispassionate socio-scientific material used to challenge popular myths and stereotypes about people. Human rights legislation on this continent is the skillful blending of educational and legal techniques in the pursuit of social justice. Our legislation places parameters around the Commission's operations and what we can do. In Alberta, we offer protection against discrimination between organizations and individuals. What we don't do is provide protection between individuals on private matters. The legislation is also very broad and non-specific, and it speaks to the grounds and areas, it speaks to the defenses available if someone is alleged to have contravened the legislation, but really the specific application and interpretation is informed by case law, which is ever developing. Now, states, provinces, or other jurisdictions often end up with undeserved reputations based on stereotypical assumptions. And from elsewhere in Canada, we sometimes hear Alberta being characterized in a stereotypical way as a redneck province, as somehow intolerant and not supportive of human rights. And research tells us that that is not the case. 85% of Albertans believe that human rights are very well or fairly well protected, and this has been a consistent finding over the year. Almost all Albertans, 96%, believe that it is very or somewhat important to their overall quality of life in their community to have an environment that is free of discrimination. And again, this has been consistent over the years. And most, 82%, strongly or somewhat agree that people in Alberta have the opportunity to participate without discrimination. Well, is that true? Despite the belief that by the majority of Albertans that human rights are well protected and it's important to them to live in an environment free of discrimination, we know that some Albertans experience discrimination and face barriers to full inclusion. Two of the indicators of this for the Commission are the volume of inquiries and the number of complaints that we receive. We suspect that the volume of inquiries and complaints that reach the Commission are really only an indication of the larger number of incidents involving discrimination that are out there. And in addition to an increase in the volume of complaints, and this past year there were 835 that were opened with the Commission, but 30,000 to 40,000 inquiries that were received. Cases are becoming more complex than in previous years. In part, this is due to the evolving nature of human rights and the number of grounds cited by each complainant. The volume and complexity puts greater pressure on our complaint resolution processes, and we constantly find ourselves struggling to innovate and find efficiencies in order to provide more effective and timely and high-quality resolution services. Given the increasing diversity in the province, we're seeing more issues of conflicting rights as well. And more of our complaints are raising issues of subtle and systemic discrimination, which are more challenging to address. For example, we may receive a complaint by one party against another party in what is really an industry-wide or sector-wide or society-wide problem that requires the participation of numerous players to attempt to resolve it if we're looking for a sustainable solution. And I canvassed my colleagues across the country before coming here. I wanted to share with you some of the issues facing commissions across Canada of that nature. And here's what they told me, and we experience many of these in Alberta: disability issues, drug and alcohol testing in the workplace, age discrimination, and issues of mandatory retirement in jurisdictions where there is an upper age limit on the protection underage employment. Of course, you can't open a newspaper today without reading about same-sex marriage, racism and racial profiling, accommodation issues related to disability, cultural, religious, and differences. Gender issues continue on the basis of pregnancy, maternity leave, sexual harassment. We're seeing emerging issues around compassionate care leave, bullying, homophobia, and discrimination against Aboriginal people. So these are continuing issues. Our work is made more challenging, as I've said, because human rights case law is constantly evolving. And we're also operating in a more increasingly litigious environment. It's rare now to find a respondent, and a respondent is the party against whom a human rights complaint is lodged. So the respondent is the organization who's alleged to have done the discriminatory act or behavior. It's rare for them to come to the table without their own legal counsel. And so that is making our work more complex. We have an increasing diversity of interests and stakeholders, yet we have a continuing need to build awareness about the protection available to Albertans and their responsibilities under the legislation. Given the volume of complaints, many commissions across Canada are facing challenges in finding adequate resources for the proactive, preventative educational side of their mandate. Just as in healthcare, acute trumps preventative. And so our work on a rising caseload with timelines that we don't want to get called to court on when we find that they're getting too long, end up drawing resources away from what we believe ultimately is the more important preventative work that needs to be done. What we've recently done in our commission is we've moved to a model that is an outcome-based logic model. And what we're trying to do is show in a more dynamic way how the inputs that we have, the resources we work with, lead to the activities or what we do, that those lead to outputs or short-term results, and that those then lead to outcomes or changes in society, and eventually to a long-term impact, which is the vision or goal that we're working towards. And so what we want to do is, in our organization, is move past the traditional focus on resources and activities to explore how they connect with each other and with changing organizations and in building community capacity. We want to link what we do with what we want to change. In terms of our outcomes or purpose, what we're trying to do is build greater sensitivity and know-how by organizations and individuals to interpret Alberta's human rights legislation and act on human rights and diversity issues. We'd like to see increased alignment by users of Commission services with the principles of the legislation. We'd like to see human rights and diversity considerations informing legislation and policies and programs of other government and related agencies. And finally, we want Albertans to perceive the Commission as credible, accessible, and authoritative. The impact statement is really the big picture. It's what we're working towards, and it's not something the Commission alone can do. It really answers the question, why? Why is our work important? What are we trying to achieve? I'd like to go on and just spend a moment talking about resolving and adjudicating complaints. This slide shows you something about the percentage of grounds that are cited in the files that were opened last year, and you can see that physical disability was the most frequently cited ground, followed by gender, and then followed by mental disability. And if you add those two disability categories together, you see that 41% of the grounds cited in human rights complaints in Alberta cite disability in one form or another. This is a huge area, and the disability community has been very active in ensuring that its members understand about the rights and the accessibility issues. Race and color and ancestry and origin, these are often interlinked, and so they total 18% of our grounds. And we have a lot of complaints. This slide just shows you some of our smaller numbers. A lot of our complainants cite multiple grounds, reflecting that they're really facing multiple barriers. Maybe it's a woman, maybe it's a woman who's also from a minority background of some kind, maybe it's someone who's also disabled. So we get those kinds of complaints coming forward. The next slide shows us the 7 different areas in which we can accept complaints, and by far, and this has been consistent over the years, employment is our key area where we're dealing with discrimination and allegations of discrimination. Followed closely by goods and services. What that means is things like educational services, things like retail services. Our complaint process is pretty standard along with other commissions. Our legislation is complaint driven. It has to be triggered by a complaint. We're not the human rights police. We're not an enforcement agency that goes out there and looks for abuses. People have to come to the commission, so that brings its own issues with it. And complaints are assessed, they're not automatically accepted. What we try to do is conciliate or mediate complaints, and then if that doesn't work, we investigate them, we analyze the facts, and we come up with a recommendation about whether we believe discrimination occurred or is likely to have not occurred. And our emphasis always is on settlement, not on enforcement. What we're trying to do is support the parties attempting to resolve and settle complaints. There's a very small percentage of complaints, 4% annually, 4 or 5%, and they will go on to a different stage in our process. They'll be heard before the Chief Commissioner or a Human Rights Panel. The Human Rights Panel is a quasi-judicial body, and they have all the same powers as a court, but that's a very small number of complaints that go. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see the kinds of closures that we had in 2000 and 2003. And in fact, 59% of the complaints that came to the commission closed through mediation, a form of mediation that we call conciliation. So that means that the parties, with the assistance of the commission in a neutral role, were able to come together and come to a solution that closed that complaint. Just a small word about remedies. In Alberta, really we're looking, and in Canada as a whole, we're looking for justice, not reward or punishment. And so our approach to remedy is restorative and remedial, not punitive. And remedies range and are very case specific to a particular complaint. It may involve money, it may not involve money. It may be as simple as an apology to a complainant from the party alleged to have done the discrimination. But it may also involve dollars, it may involve restoring rights and opportunities that were lost. And in some cases, it involves policies that have a much greater impact. So even though our legislation is really about the violation and resolution of individual rights, what we sometimes find is that there are much broader ramifications, and we can talk about that perhaps later. In terms of education and promotion, I said earlier this was really our most important work. When I say our most important work, I think I mean everybody in this room. We all have the potential to create change and to work towards social justice. It's the hardest work to measure. It's a shared responsibility with schools and educational institutions, community organizations, employers, advocacy groups, families, research institutes, individuals. We've taken a building block approach to thinking about our educational work, beginning with building awareness about human rights, about diversity, and about the commission and its processes and responsibilities. So in terms of building awareness, we develop information resources, we have a comprehensive website, an electronic newsletter, we do presentations, workshops, displays. We've partnered with business through the Chambers of Commerce to establish a Diversity Leadership Award, because we want to recognize, rather than taking a punitive approach, we want to recognize the good work that's being done by some employers and really publicize that more and use that as a model of excellence for other employers to work with. So we don't do the work, it's the employers working with the employers around those best practices. In terms of understanding and building knowledge and skills, we have a confidential inquiry service. We develop in-depth and comprehensive resources targeted to specific audiences and topics. We'll review an organization's not legal policy. We'll review an organization's anti-discrimination policy to ensure that it aligns with the legislation. We do in-depth workshops for organizations on building inclusive workplaces, and we've conducted significant research to find out how we can do our job better. 2 years ago, we did a survey of over 560 employers in Alberta to find out what their issues were in human rights and how we can help them meet their mandate, and their legal responsibility, which is to ensure a discrimination-free environment in the workplace. So we see our role there as supporting employers in building that inclusive workplace, not doing it for them, but making sure they've got some tools to support them in that work. We also finally do a lot of collaborative work, and this is an area that's really developed for us over the last few years. And let me give you one specific example, and that is an accommodation bulletin that we've developed with disability service providers located in post-secondary institutions across Alberta. They came to us after they saw our first accommodation bulletin, and they said, you know, we'd like to work with you to see if we can adjust this and build something that is very specific to educational institutions, post-secondary institutions, because we have students with disabilities, and we need to know how best to serve their needs, and we'd like a tool that will do that. So we've worked with representatives of universities and colleges across Alberta, with advocates, disability advocacy groups, and with students with disabilities to build a new bulletin that is really groundbreaking. It's the first bulletin in the country that really addresses those needs. We're working with other governments on the first ever publication that provides a one-window approach to understanding the benefits, entitlements, and protections available if you're becoming a parent. We're working on a model medical absence forms and return to work and school with limitations form with the medical and insurance communities. We're working with management, labor, and other government departments and agencies on policies and issues to try to reduce impairment in the workplace. Again, with various government departments on a strategy to assist skilled immigrants to integrate into the economic life of the province more easily, and the list goes on. So before we turn to the video, I just want to say now thank you for inviting me and hosting me. I want to invite you to visit our website. You can sign up for our free electronic newsletter, and I've also sent along samples of some of our materials that I think are here perhaps at the back of the room if you wanted to take a look at some of those. Although we're in different jurisdictions, we can learn much from each other because I think we're all working to build community capacity and build a society that rests on shared vision and values. That concludes my slides, and I just want to say, I know I've gone a bit over, I'm fine. I want to say just a few words about the video you're going to see. Raising awareness about human rights and diversity, as I mentioned, is a foundational piece of our educational work and something we want to achieve. We also know that 76% of Albertans say that their main source of information about human rights is the media. And when we took those two pieces of information together with concerns that had been expressed to us by ethnocultural leaders about the need for greater attention in the media, especially after 9/11, where there were certainly some impacts on the ethnocultural community in Canada, we partnered with a major Alberta television network, Global TV, and we developed a series of 5 ads to raise awareness about the benefits of diversity, focusing specifically in the ethnocultural area. The key message of these ads is to encourage Albertans to contribute to building a fair and respectful society through their own actions. The first ad you'll see is an overview. It's a 30-second ad, and then you'll see 4 one-minute ads that feature the unscripted voices of Albertans talking about their beliefs and values related to human rights and how they have made a difference and want to make a difference. There's a complimentary website. The address is on the ads, and where you can read about the participants. You can actually see the ads, link to other websites, and you can get some tips on things that you can do, or we can all do in our own communities to make a difference. So maybe we can launch into that. Thank you.
Respect for one another, and healthy community, treating each other fair every day. We all contribute. Let's learn from one another. See the world through the eyes of our neighbors. Take action to build inclusive communities. It's up to us to make a difference.
We each have a part to play. To find out how you can make a difference, please visit the website below.
Brought to you by the Government of Alberta and Global Television. We are each unique. Our diversity makes us stronger. Respect for one another builds caring and healthy communities. Treating each other fairly every day means we can all contribute. Let's learn from one another, see the world through the eyes of our neighbors, and take action to build inclusive communities. It's up to us to make a difference. To find out how you can make a difference, please visit the website below. This message has been brought to you by the Government of Alberta and Global Television.
One of them featured a Calgary newscaster, so I was specific to the Calgary market.
Every human is important. Give all your heart and all your attention at the time they're talking to you. And doing it this way, you build a good system and reduce the society which is in harmony and together as a unit.
Disagree with me? Absolutely. But listen to me. For listening, I think, is the foundation of building respect.
I think when you understand people's cultures and respect them for what they are, it's a joy for me.
You want people to treat you in a certain way. Well, how are you going to get that treatment? You need to treat them that way first. That is something that's crucial for our happiness.
Treat people equally. Give them their freedom.
Together, we will bridge our differences and we will make a difference.
This message has been brought to you by the Government of Alberta and Global Television.
Human rights is a concept. You're all celebrated for the special qualities that exist inside all of us. The qualities, the good qualities, which are an innate part of human nature.
Everyone is a product of where we grow up and who we grow up with. So I think that one of the human rights that's the most important to me is the right to know that you have rights and the right to be able to understand them.
Try and change the world by changing yourself. And to always be kind. And to lead by example.
Interact and learn from other people.
It is essential to challenge yourself as an individual, but I also believe that it's essential to challenge others, as that's when change occurs. If you don't challenge individuals on these thoughts that you can all agree with, then there's that sense of complacency.
We all want the same things. We all want to live in a society where we feel secure, where we feel respected, and where we feel safe.
Reach out against racism. We can make a difference.
Brought to you by the Government of Alberta and Global Television.
Everyone should be a voice for human rights. There's a huge shift in the way people view one another, and especially an opening and an understanding and a curiosity of other worldviews.
People want to feel that whatever their background may be, ancestrally or otherwise, is something that they should feel free to express and be proud of.
You express yourself, people will listen to you, and if all Canadians participate in our process, we can have a better society.
I really believe it's something we have to really be engaged in and make sure that it's in action in our communities and in our families.
The more we know about each other, the less we fear our differences.
We are different. We are all different. You have to respect me. I have to respect you.
Reach out and gain person. Together, we can make a difference.
Brought to you by the Government of Alberta and Global Television.
I feel diversity gives a lot of strength to Canadian society. Color does not make a man. It's the inside heart that makes a man.
There comes a time in your life when you have to put aside what you've been taught or what's been accepted and make up your mind for yourself, what you feel in your heart and how that's going to improve your life and those around you.
If I respect you and you respect me back, if I try to understand you and you make as much effort to do that, the society will be better. Try to not be judgmental and try to be open-minded about other people. And that's how human societies are nurtured.
We have to overcome these insecurities and see that there is a better way to live, a better way to come together and make our communities strong and free.
This society has a room for all of us. You will make a difference.
This message has been brought to you by the Government of Alberta and Global Television.
Cassie, thank you so very much. That was powerful stuff. I'll go ahead and introduce our next presenter. She'll come forth now. Let's
Tony and everybody. Am I doing okay with the mic? Hear me? Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me up. It was a wonderful opportunity to come up here. I've heard a lot about the Popcorn Forum over the years, and this is my first chance to be here, so I'm just very pleased. I am the low-tech presenter, which means I don't have a PowerPoint, and I don't have a video. I do have a mic, and I'm pleased to see that. The last presentation that I did, I have to tell you, I didn't have a mic. I was over in Idaho Falls, and it was a huge room. I was doing a presentation to about 100 ditch riders, and they really wanted to be there, as you can imagine. And there was no mic, and there was no way in the world that I could talk to them. And so the hotel didn't have a mic, but they came up with this very interesting machine. It was a little rectangular thing with a little handheld thing, and they finally told me that it was a karaoke machine. So I learned about karaoke machines, but I'm happy to have a mic instead. As Tony said, I have a lot of years into the Human Rights Commission, and he was being very tactful by saying that I had been their legal counsel for a number of years. That number is actually 20. And then I've been the director for 6. So I've got 26 years in working with the Idaho Human Rights Commission. And I feel very strongly and obviously very dedicated to the work that they do. And so I'm going to try to be honest with you about what I think its strengths and what its weaknesses are without trying to sound whiny, because I don't want to sound whiny. But I also want to be honest with you about what we have and what we don't. Oftentimes I find out that people are surprised to realize that Idaho has had a comprehensive anti-discrimination law in place since, believe it or not, 1969. And when I tell people that, they say, woo, why in the world? Idaho, since 1969, has had a comprehensive anti-discrimination law. We really have, but I have to tell you the story why we do, very briefly. In 1964, the federal government passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and that dealt specifically with the area of employment discrimination, and that was actually at the federal level the very first effort to prohibit discrimination in the workplace, and that statute prohibited discrimination on the basis of race and sex and color and religion and national origin. I think that if you go back and look at the legislative history, you can see that their primary concern in passing that federal legislation was race discrimination, and the horrific economic effect that our history of discriminating, especially against African Americans, had left in our country. And so that was really what they were trying to address more than anything else. And that's what the legislative history tells you. It also tells you the accident which caused it to prohibit sex discrimination. And some people don't know that, but I'll tell you that little part too. The original bill did not prohibit sex discrimination in employment. And it actually got added in by a Southern congressman who was opposed to the bill and was trying to get it defeated. And so his brilliant idea was that he would add this amendment that would prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex in employment, and no right-minded Congress was going to pass that, and so he would defeat the bill. Except it worked. It worked for us. It didn't work for him. And that is actually how sex discrimination came to be a part of the federal legislation. Well, that was 1964, and that was the federal legislation. But I told you that Idaho has had its own statute since 1969. Well, the federal legislation is part of that, and it's related to it, in that one of the provisions of the federal law is sort of what I would call a states' rights provision. And basically what it said is that if a state has its own anti-discrimination law that has pretty much the same kind of coverage that the federal law does, and also has a state entity, a state mechanism for trying to resolve complaints under that state law, the federal law cannot be invoked until the state law has had an opportunity to try to deal with the problem and try to resolve it. And if that doesn't work, then the federal law can be pulled in. But the state should have an opportunity to try it first, to try to take care of the situation. So you can imagine that sort of states' rights provision was appealing to Idaho, and they liked the idea of having a state, having those kinds of problems, which they were saying they didn't have, but just in case they did, to have a state people and a state commission involved in trying to resolve those complaints. So that was part of what happened. The other thing that happened, I know only because there was a gentleman that sort of wrote a history of the early days of the Human Rights Commission, and I am so thankful that he did, because this next story that I'm going to tell you, nobody would know if this gentleman named Don Nickren had not sat down and done some oral interviews and recorded this. The next thing that happened was when Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. One of the things that the president asked states to do was to fly their flags at half-mast in state buildings during the time period before his interment. Well, Idaho did wish to do that. And so Idaho did not lower its flags. And of course, this is April of 1968. This enraged the small black community in Boise, and Don's paper says it probably the rest of the state too, but especially in Boise. And on Good Friday in 1968, Boise had its very first civil rights rally. And the newspapers all said there were outside agitators coming in from California and all of that stuff, but really it was local people who convened on the State House steps. There was a black attorney by the name of Curtis Orr, who was with a federal agency, just happened to be stationed in Boise at the time, and he spoke at this rally. And one of the things that he spoke about was that Idaho should have its own anti-discrimination law. And that's what got it started. So out of the ashes of this kind of attitude towards not being as respectful to Dr. Martin Luther King as other folks had wanted us to be, came this impetus for Idaho to pass its own civil rights statute. And that sort of got a committee going and got it started. The next major player in all of that was then Senator Phil Batt, who carried the legislation. And I think that was a very heartfelt and genuine thing on his part. He had grown up in Idaho, in rural Idaho. He had seen particularly the discrimination against people who were Hispanic. And I think he felt very personally and very strongly about Idaho doing something to address that. And so if you read his later writings, he said he lost some very good friends during that time period and he never got them back. But he thought that he was doing the right thing. So at any rate, 1968, 1969, the legislation got passed and it got through the legislature. It wasn't the original bill that Curtis Orr originally was sort of helping people put together, because strangest thing, in the middle of all of this, because he was sort of being the informal advisor to the group that was trying to put the legislation together, he got sent up to Alaska. He got assigned to Alaska and didn't get back. And who knows why that happened? I don't know. I wasn't even in the state at the time. I don't know why that happened. But anyway, he got sent up to Alaska. The bill got watered down quite a bit, but it did get passed. And so from 1969 forward, Idaho has had what actually is a quite comprehensive civil rights statute, human rights statute. Over the years, it has been amended to take care of some of its flaws. There still are some, but the bill at this point, or the statute at this point, prohibits discrimination in the areas of employment, access to educational services, access to places of public accommodation, and housing. The vast majority of the complaints that come to us are the same that Cassie was saying, are employment discrimination complaints, but we do cover the other areas too. Over the years, again, it's been amended from time to time, but now it prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, sex, color, religion, and national origin, age, if you're 40 or over, and disability, both mental and physical disabilities. So it actually does cover a lot of things. It has a broader coverage in some respects than the federal law does. We were dealing with cases of disability discrimination long before the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act passed at the federal level, so we had experience with that beforehand. The Idaho law also reaches down to employers who have 5 or more employees, whereas the federal laws pick up at 15. So there are some small employers, and as you can imagine, Idaho has a fair number of small employers who fit in between that 15 and 5 categories. So we do reach some smaller employers. The statute is comprehensive in that it covers all areas of, in the employment relationship. It covers the way that you advertise for jobs, the recruiting that you do, the hiring processes, how much people are paid, the terms and conditions of employment, the assignments that you get. All of those things are covered under the statute. And the statute also requires that people be treated equally. And one of the messages that I always have to give, and I always get this big looks of disbelief on people's faces when I tell them this, the statute, neither at the federal level nor at the state level, the statutes do not give preferences to people because they are minorities or because they are women. What the statutes do is to say that people need to be treated equally, that whatever the color of your skin is, it should have nothing to do with your salary. Or whether you are male or whether you are female. Both of those categories are equally protected. And you should not be the victim of sexual harassment, for example, whether you are male or whether you are female. It's a requirement of neutrality, not a requirement of preference. I just wanted to share with you sort of what we do with our lives. We're still a very small state agency. We have 11 full-time positions, plus we have access to a deputy attorney general who works with us full-time and is absolutely crucial to what we do. That's the staff, and we are supposed to do the administrative enforcement of this statute throughout the whole state of Idaho. We have one office in the city of Boise, so as you can imagine, we have a heck of a phone bill, but that's what we do. We accept we don't take collect calls anymore because we have a toll-free number. So we do take a lot of callings in and we do a lot of calling out. We do as much travel as we can possibly get in, but it's very difficult on the limited budget. And that's one of the reasons why I haven't been up to the Popcorn Forum before, and Tony managed to make it financially possible for me to come up and do this. The staff is very, very dedicated, and even though we're small, sometimes it's a little bit frustrating that you feel like you want to really be able to get up and out and see what's going on in northern Idaho. We don't always have the money to do that or to get over to eastern Idaho. They still feel very strongly about enforcing the law as best they can. And when we're in the process of doing this, the focus is on being an advocate for the statute. We're not an advocate for one group or another. We're an advocate for the statute, and that's the way that we train ourselves. And that's the perspective that we bring to each particular case that we're looking at. That's the charge processing part of what we do. As Cassie said, we have other emphasis as well. And the educational part of the work is something that we all enjoy doing, but it is very, very difficult to have funding for that. In Idaho, you may have noticed there's not a federal equal employment opportunity office commission within the state of Idaho. The nearest one is in Seattle, and what they have found is that it is less expensive to contract with the Idaho Human Rights Commission to handle the federal cases within the state than have a federal office in the state. So in addition to the funding that we get through the Idaho legislature, we also have a contract with the federal government for case processing. And so we handle the state cases and the federal cases as well. That helps to fund the case processing. We have never had a specific budget that has been given to us for educational purposes. And whenever I have tried to take that to the legislature, that gets shot down as something that really isn't necessary, but it is necessary to do. So the way that we handle the educational functions is to try to partner as much as we can with private nonprofit groups that are also interested in human rights. And fortunately, over the last few years, there have been a number of groups that have sort of sprung up. I think that the importance of human rights has become more evident in the last few years, and certainly within the state of Idaho than it was, let's say, even 5 years ago. And so there are a number of nonprofit groups that are doing educational work in the area of human rights, and as much as possible, we try to work with them and support what they're doing, and in order to kind of spread ourselves out. Tony mentioned Marilyn Schuler, who was my predecessor as the director of the Human Rights Commission, and I had lunch with her just not too long ago, and she said that her experience working as the director of the Human Rights Commission was such a good experience for her in terms of learning how to do things without any money. And she said, it's the strangest thing. Now she's working with groups and they say, well, we don't have enough money to do this, and so they're not going to do it. And she's sitting there thinking, well, now, if you do this and you do that, and this is how you can get the money, they're saying, no, Marilyn, we said we don't have enough money. We're not going to do that. And I can really relate to what she's saying. We do try to broker ourselves out as much as possible to do the educational work. But in terms of where most of our resources go, it does go to that enforcement piece. In addition to the staff with the 11 full-time positions and the deputy AG, we also have a board of commissioners. And the commissioners are appointed by the governor and approved by the Senate. And they do come from all over the state. And the best of all worlds for me as the director is for the commissioners to play the role of sort of being the eyes and the ears of whatever the civil rights issues are that are from their communities. So for example, we have somebody from Hayden Lake, we have somebody from Blackfoot, we have somebody from Pocatello, we have somebody in Twin Falls, a couple people from the Boise area, somebody from Nampa, somebody from Marcy. And that is really helpful if they can do that. And that sort of depends on their personalities because they don't exactly get paid for this. But that again gives us the opportunity to reach out to the communities that we can't reach to very well when we're just kind of stuck in Boise without a lot of travel money. The commissioners under our system are the people who actually make the decisions on cases. And that is a little bit different from other states. And the reason for that is that the Idaho statute, and I told you 10 minutes ago very quickly, that the final bill that got passed was somewhat weaker than the one that they started out with. One of the weaknesses of that bill is that it did not give the Human Rights Commission the authority to issue orders or to hold hearings. And we have never had the authority to do that. So the way our system works is if a person feels that he has been the victim of discrimination, he can contact our office and can talk with an intake person. And that is sort of a confidential communication between the person who calls and the intake person. And the person will call, the caller will say, I just lost my job, and I think it's because I'm Hispanic. And the intake person will say, okay, well, you lost your job, and when did that happen, and all of that stuff, and make sure it's jurisdictional with us. And they'll say, well, okay, now tell me what makes you think that it's because you're Hispanic. What reason did they give you, for example, as to why you lost your job? Well, they said that it was because I put the heister through the wall. And what makes you think it wasn't because you put the heister through the wall? Because that could very well be a reason for losing your job. Well, because other people have done that. And they don't get fired for that. And that's not a very good example, because people usually do get fired for that one. But my point is that they have to have a reason. They have to have some reason to tie it in their own mind. As to, I'm calling you because I think it was because of my gender, or I think it was because of my race, or I think it's because I'm 60 years old. And we explore with that person what makes them think that. If it looks as if that may actually be what happened, when you talk to them, it makes sense, it's logical, they can give you 3 examples of people who made the same error and who are still there and happen to be white males or whatever the comparative is. Or sometimes there's direct evidence that somebody is saying, we don't want any old people here. The sales force is getting too old. We need younger people in the office. We'll have that kind of direct evidence of discrimination. That person can then file a complaint with us. During fiscal year 2003, we had 579 formal complaints of that kind filed with us, formal filings with us, 579. For each of those complaints that are actually filed with us, we get about 20 intake calls. So I think that probably our informal intakes are similar in nature to what you were mentioning, Cassie. We have a whole lot more of those. And those 19 that don't file are sometimes people who are still employed at a place and really want to try to work it out, and our intake people will assist them in figuring out ways to work it out themselves. Or sometimes, they just decide they don't want to pursue it. It's not worth it to them. And sometimes they can't really articulate what it is that makes them think that it was because of their gender or because of their race. And so they go away and they think about it for a while, and then maybe they don't pursue it. But there's about 19 that don't for each one that does. The very first thing that we do when a complaint comes in the door is to try to mediate it. And we have 2 senior investigators on our staff whose job is primarily mediation. And at that point, we are really being neutral. We don't know whether the law has been violated or not. We have no idea. We've got this complaint, we've got this answer. They're saying 2 different things. The whole purpose of the mediation is to let them see if there is some ground that they can agree to, and then walk away. Nobody's happy when they walk away from a mediated settlement, but they can both walk away from it. That's the first effort that we make. If that is not successful, the case gets transferred to an investigator. The investigator's job is to be take that neutral look. Again, not being an advocate for anything other than the statute. And the investigator goes to the one party and says, what makes you think it was discrimination? Goes to the other party and says, tell me your version of what happened. They prepare a report, and then that is reviewed by our 9 commissioners. And they are the ones who actually say, yes, we think discrimination occurred, or no, we don't. If the answer to that is, no, we don't, the case is dismissed out of the system. The person then gets a right to sue letter. And once they have been through that administrative process, and even if we have come out with a no cause finding, they still get a right to sue letter. And if they're going to pursue that case in court, they then have the right to do that, and it needs to be filed within 90 days of the date of that right to sue letter. Now, if the commission's answer is yes, we find probable cause to believe that discrimination did occur, then the case kicks back to our staff, but now we are wearing another hat. Now we are wearing an advocate's hat, because at that point we think the law has been violated, and we think we've got a victim of discrimination on our hands. And at that point we are advocating now for resolution of that complaint to the benefit of the injured party, and very importantly, and Cassie touched on this too, very importantly to whatever was going on in that workplace or in that housing complex that caused that act of discrimination to occur. So when we conciliate a case, when we have found that we think discrimination occurred, we are looking for making the person whole that brought the complaint to us, and also trying to correct whatever the problem was that caused that act of discrimination to occur. To us, that is the public interest in the enforcement of the human rights statute, so that people who are coming up the line behind that Hispanic person don't have the same thing that happened to them. This has been absolutely crucial, I think, in the area of disability discrimination. Cassie mentioned that an awful lot of the complaints that came to them are disability discrimination. We are experiencing the same thing. Our percentage was not quite as high as yours, but it runs around 30% on a regular basis. And we find a lot of things happening systemically in the area of disability discrimination, and with employment applications to begin with. And so whenever we get an employment application into the office, whether it's a race case or a disability case or whatever it is, we go through that application and look to see if it's violating the disability discrimination statutes. And I would say probably about half the time they are. When we find that violation, we immediately get back to that employer, let them know what the problem with the application is, and get it fixed. Sometimes they're pretty subtle, and sometimes they're amazingly unsolved. We were dealing with one not from this part of the state, and actually it was a case that I handled. I just couldn't believe it. I got the application. Do you remember back in the old days before the Disability Acts were passed, that where an employment application would have a whole list of medical conditions and ask you if you had ever had any one of those, like foot problems and asthma, breathing problems, and all of this stuff. If you ever been sick, if you ever had an operation? We used to have applications like that all the time. I ran into one of those just last year, and the very first question on that application was, have you ever been insane? And I'm sitting there looking at it thinking, why, yes, as a matter of fact, I am insane right now. You are making me that way. So we try to get those things cleared whenever we can. That's an important thing for us. If all of that doesn't work, and you've got a situation on our hands where we think discrimination has occurred, we've not been able to resolve it, what the Idaho statute permits us to do is for the Human Rights Commission to file an action in district court where we are the plaintiff and we sue on behalf of the injured party. And we handle all the legal expenses for that. Now, obviously, we can't take every single case because we don't have the resources to do it, but we can take some. And so we try to pick those cases that would have the broadest impact, those cases that are raising issues such as same-gender harassment is one that we're looking at right now, which there hasn't been much litigation within the state of Idaho on that. So we're interested in doing that. But that's the end mechanism for us, that we can file an action in district court. We try the case as the plaintiff, and if we win, then the relief goes to the complaining party. The other avenue for enforcement of the statute is that the private person can bring a claim in district court. And for years and years I worked with this system, and I thought, there's always that fail-safe. The person can go to their private attorney, because often they do come to us with private attorneys in hand, representing people on both sides of the cases. And I always had it in the back of my mind, well, if our system doesn't work for them, they can always go to district court. It finally just dawned on me, after a lot of years of thinking that way, that theoretically that is so, but the truth of the matter is, very, very few people really have the resources to do that. And I would bet out of the 579 administrative cases that were filed with us, maybe 15 or 20, and that's probably overestimating what got filed in district court during that same time period. And realizing that was sobering to me, thinking how important that administrative process is, that it work well, and that it work right, and that it be a good vindication for people whose rights have been violated. And that it also be a good process for those people who are wrongly accused of discrimination, because that happens as well. And I think it doesn't usually happen because somebody's being vindictive, but I think it happens because a situation has been badly handled or badly managed, and people are very defensive when they're accused of having discriminated against people. And they need to believe that the system works for them too. So that's what we try to do. I think that takes care of my time. But that's the system in Idaho. I do want to let you know that we have a website. And if I can find where I wrote down the address, I would like to give that to you, because we actually have gotten some very nice compliments on our website. The website is www.state.id.us, and then I guess that's a backslash, the one that goes like that, or slash, okay, whatever, one that looks like that, IHRC. And if you go to that, we have the federal laws on there, we have state laws on there, we have information about all the issues that we see, such as disability discrimination, sexual harassment, some technical assistance resources, contact information. We have a directory of human relations groups that exist within the state of Idaho. So we try to have that be a good information piece for people. And then also there's always the option of contacting the commission for additional help. Thank you.
She's on the board of the Human Rights Education Institute, as well as the Idaho Human Rights Education Center, and a number of other boards. And so she will go first. Mary Lou.
Thank you, Tony, and good afternoon, everyone. I think this is a fascinating topic. The reason I'm here, I believe, is to sort of localize it, to say what are we doing here and what is the Human Rights Education Institute up to. And so I'll be as brief as possible because I would like to, we have a couple of questions for our speakers, and then I'm sure you would like to have some questions too. But everything that has been done by the Human Rights Education Institute, which was formed in 1998, when some of us realized after the Lemons for Lemonade project, in which the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations had taken advantage of the fact that the Aryan nations were having another parade, and Tony Stewart, who was the really clever one, decided that he would pick up on an idea and turn lemons into lemonade. If the Aryan nations were going to march down Sherman Avenue, the best thing we could do would be to make the best of it. And so the idea was for individuals to pledge 5 cents, 10 cents, $5 for every minute that the Aryan nations were going to march. And so we were caught in that situation where we didn't know if we wanted them to scramble and get their parade over with, which would make us happy, or if we wanted them to go very slowly. For every step, we would make more money for human rights. Turned out, I think Tony said that they marched for 27 minutes, is that right? 27 minutes. The task force pulled in $35,000, which was a lot of money, and then gave it, bulk of it, $24,000, in the form of competitive grants to teachers in our local schools to use for materials, resources in their classrooms to promote human rights. So after that, it appeared to a lot of us, not only was the Task Force on Human Relations using, holding on to too much money, but also education was the finer long-term solution to this whole issue of hate and discrimination. So we formed a sister organization hand in hand with the task force, and this sister organization was going to be there to develop educational programs and to raise money. This was before the trial in which the Aryan nations were bankrupted. A wonderful gentleman came into the picture, Greg Carr, who not only bought the old compound of the Aryan nations, and gave it to the North Idaho College Foundation, but also came to our organization, which did at that time have a tax status that would permit us to receive foundation dollars, and asked if we would indeed create a human rights center. So it was a very exciting opportunity. We have been plugging away at it ever since, under the premise that we as a nonprofit organization would be able to use preventive measures to deal with this whole issue of hate. So we have developed a strategic plan, and our vision is basically to operate within the inland Northwest and try to do everything we can through education to create a region in which there are no barriers to discrimination, that everyone is judged on merit, not by the color of skin or by the language of their tongue or whether they have a ponytail or whether they're sporting a tattoo or anything of that nature, recognizing that our economy could only flourish if a diversity was present, and that diversity indeed does make for a vibrant community. Vibrant community attracts creative minds, and creative minds may be the economic collateral of the future. So then very briefly, let me tell you what our plan is. Our plan is to operate sort of on 4 basic objectives. One is to outreach to the schools, to work with the school districts, and to bring more resources into the schools. So it's a school-based program in which we are doing what the original branding aimed to do, was just bring more resources to the existing situation. Then we want to work with colleges and universities to help train teachers who are always crying for more information, for more tools to deal with the whole issue of teaching respect, and for people to understand how they really need to appreciate and respect each other. Then our third area is going to be to develop community programs, dialogue, workshops, bringing in members of the adult community for them to have a greater understanding of what's ahead, for everyone to understand that as our globe shrinks, it is so important that we prepare our students and our adults to compete on a global level, which is increasingly complex, increasingly diverse, and increasingly competitive. And then our final tool is going to be building a place, and we do have the old Cultural Center, which is the brick building on the corner of the Coeur d'Alene City Park, releasing it from the city of Coeur d'Alene, and hope to build it into a place where we can have exhibits that are both permanent and traveling, that will provide exciting and dramatic experiences for people to visit them. So basically, it's an education program that may have a place, that will have a place, and we feel it is a very exciting opportunity to deal with this complex but very human issue. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much. And our other panelist is Carlos DeGaldo, who is the advisor to the Northern Idaho Center for Higher Education, and Carlos is also the Popcorn Forum Committee. He and another member of that center has joined us, and what a great asset you have been. And he also is going to respond to the speakers. And I might say that the center that he is with represents Idaho College, University of Idaho, and Idaho State University, and Lewis Clark State College. So they do a lot of work in education here in North Idaho for all these institutions. Carlos?
Thanks, Tony. I'm really honored, actually, to be in the midst of all these wonderful people. I was trying to figure out why Tony asked me to do this, and I think they were looking for the average Joe, just to add a little balance to the group. But one of the things that, because of the position I have, and the various positions I've had in the past, I was in the military for a long time, and I was in education and training, and I think everybody's touched on it, and I've written it down in my notes several times. I'm a big believer in education and training, and how important it is, and particularly within this subject that we're talking about, human rights and diversity and race relations and everything. And we can't do anything without education. And that's not just educating the general public, but in my mind also educating those of you and those of us that have the wherewithal to do something about it. And so I was kind of curious, and I know I'm not supposed to bring up any questions yet, but I think I'm very curious as to how do you train the trainers, that sort of thing. How have you gotten where you are today? And so that was one of the things that I wrote down. The other thing that I noticed, and I think everybody brought this up, and that's how does this all come about? Why do people have problems with race relations? Why do we have trouble getting along with each other? And a lot of it, I think, and these are my parents talking right now, a lot of it has to do with mutual respect and how we're taught. And it comes down to sometimes what we hear politicians say all the time, although I'm not sure they necessarily say it from the heart, but I hope they do. And that's that the family unit and how we're treated when we're kids and how we treat our kids is how it all goes out to everybody else. It's the whole idea of mutual respect. We have so many problems nowadays, and I really think it all comes back to the family unit and how we teach our kids, how we treat them, and how we tell them to treat others. And I'd kind of like to hear other opinions come from everyone else on that. One last thing I wanted to mention, something that Christine and I, the other advisor in our center, we've kind of just recently started to get involved in disability support services. In fact, we're just kind of scratching the surface right now. And I thought it was really interesting the number of cases that are coming up in the disability area, or educational access, or access to anywhere for people that are considered disabled. So to me, that was some really telling statistics on your part, and I thought that was really interesting. So I think that's something that is really going to come out even more so in the future than it ever has before. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know that you both had a question too you want to ask, and we'll open up to the audience, but go ahead, either one of you, if you want to ask a question.
Why don't you repeat your questions and let's deal with them now? Your most important question.
Well, my most important question was, how do you get the training yourselves, and how do you train the people that work for you? I know a lot of times we're just thrust into positions, and we kind of learn on the job, but I don't think it's necessarily the right way to do it.
That's a good question. I think you're right that a lot of it is on the job. I think that the human rights area is one where people come into it through many different doors. There's not one door to enter this field. People who come and work in our commission come from backgrounds that include social sciences, political sciences, criminology, social work, law. We're increasingly getting a lot of people who are actually have been called to the bar, but would prefer not working actively as a lawyer, but want to apply the skills that they've developed through their education and apply them in this setting as human rights officers. So, people come in from very different fields into this area, and I think that's a very good thing because it is really a field that rests on community values and a community basis, and we're speaking, when we're dealing with complainants, we're dealing with people from all sectors of society, and so we want to make sure that we're accessible and that we speak the languages that they can speak. So I think that's an important thing. When people join our commission, no matter what their background is, we put them, we pair them up with a more senior person, and so we use really a mentoring approach so that they're supported as they learn the work of the commission, and we have resources and things that we make available for them. But mentoring and job shadowing are really two of the pieces that we use internally. But when you asked the question about training the trainers, what I thought of was really more of training people outside the commission to carry the message as well. And I think that's a really important part of it because, as Leslie was saying, commission in terms of our own commission being quite small, our commission is a little bit larger, but still not really big. So we really recognize that there are resource constraints to what we can do, and the important work that's being done around building the tools and building the understanding about fairness and equity and respect in the community is happening by all of us in the room. So we all have that individual responsibility, and the private not-for-profit organizations like Mary Lou was talking about, like the partnership that you do, and like I know some of the people in the room are engaged in, become really important because everyone has a responsibility to deliver those messages.
I would just say yes to all that you said. I do think that it's I just got through hiring somebody, and I was just, as we were talking about this, I was trying to think, how did I know that he was the man I wanted to hire? It was almost more the attitude that he brought to the work than anything else, because we had I probably had 25 qualified people for the job, but there was something about the way that he approached people. He actually came from a military background, which is different from other people on our staff, but there was just something about him that just said to me that he was going to be understanding, he was going to be listening to people. He had absolutely no background in this area, but he spoke to me in a manner that just convinced me that this was something that he was going to be able to hear and appreciate perspectives on all sides of problems. We don't have a lot of money to send people out to formal training, so we do what you're talking about. We mentor one another. We work with each other as we're doing these cases. And it doesn't take too long to figure out if a person is going to get it or not. We use interns a lot at the Idaho Human Rights Commission, and sometimes they catch on pretty fast, and those are the people that I've hired as investigators, and other people, they don't ever get it. and I can't exactly explain because I can't tell that in advance. But that's kind of where we get our folks. I don't know what else I was supposed to answer.
I'd like to just jump in here because I think of training the trainers as actually also training the teachers. And as I mentioned along the way, the Human Rights Education Institute, really, that was the first issue that we responded to, was the request by teachers that they have more training. They don't call it training, more education, and again, be given more tools. So before Greg Carr came on the scene, our organization held a conference in which we had at least 300 teachers, and it was a two-day conference. And I have to now invite our moderator to join in this conversation, because Tony Stewart really is the president of the Human Rights Education Institute now, and he also was instrumental in the conference that we held a few years back right here at NIC for teachers. And they really do come hungrily asking for as many methods as possible to deal with bullying, to deal with economic differences that their students may have. I don't think we've heard as much about disabilities as we probably will in the future. That has not been something that the teachers, they have ways of dealing with disabilities. But I think the important thing to talk to, in referring to training, whether it's trainers or just the original teacher, that it's never done, that it's an ongoing process, not only with the individual, but with the turnover and with the changing times. And so we found that we couldn't say after we held one conference that, well, we did that and it's over. We realized that the teachers wanted more and more, and I think that is that appetite and that desire to deal with these problems of relationships that they see in their schools is an appetite that we welcome and want to satisfy. And Tony, Clark Kent, you're out of, change into your Superman costume, you're unveiled.
Oh, she's such a good friend. She and I talked so many times, and we did want to have this conference of 300 teachers, and I was so moved by their eagerness to do that conference. Teachers, K through 12 in particular, they have such responsibility. The curricula is so broad. And I was talking to one teacher, they have 50 extra things they must do in relation to teaching. I don't know how to do it all, but I've really been impressed with the fact that that's what they want to do too. They're very sensitive and understanding. We're in a very diverse world, and they feel that in college itself, with their degrees, baccalaureate and master's, they've not been given much training, and so they want it. And Mary Lou and I decided that in our own wisdom, we would bring speakers into the students, and they said, we'd really like more training and workshops, so we backed up and listened to them, so we'll be doing more of that. With that, we would love to hear from the audience, have questions for this wonderful panel and its great expertise. Anyone have a question? We'll start here. I'll get your hand up first, and we'll go back there, please.
Yes, you were saying that you're trying to get students where they are understanding in your education of students, you actually put them in the roles. So you have a student that's making fun of another student. And then it's like in our realistic TV shows, they put on like heavy suits so that they understand what it's like to walk around for a day. Have you thought of implementing that into your schools?
If I might repeat the question for the TV camera, we're recording this. I'll paraphrase it, and that is, do you have any training for the students in the sense that I would call it simulations or role playing, put them in that same situation? Walk in the other person's shoes. Thank you.
Do you guys use that at all in anything? Even with
Leslie and
corporations
Cassie.
that you see they're discriminating against the handicapped. Have you ever thought instead of putting fines on them for a day, have them walk around blind for a day, or use a wheelchair for a day, so that it's not just catching them in the pocketbook, but it's putting them in the shoes so that they actually see where the discrimination is coming from?
Anyone can get that?
We have never done exactly what you are talking about, but I would say that we try to respond to every single request that we get from a school system to go in and talk about human rights, because I think it is so absolutely important to do that. And I have been so impressed with how quickly, at least the classes that I have been talking with, catch on and know what we're talking about, and they don't have some of the baggage that some of the rest of us have, that we've been doing things in a certain way for so long and thinking about certain groups of people in a way, and they're not captured by that stereotype thinking. I also remember not too long ago dealing with a man who has a restaurant in the fast food industry, and he was so frustrated because he was dealing with his umpteenth sexual harassment complaint coming out of his restaurant. And he was so frustrated with it. He says, look, I hire these kids, and they come in, and I expect them in the workplace to treat each other respectfully, and to not use these words and not make these gestures towards one another. But the truth of the matter is, these kids come from the high school, and they all go to school there during the day, and that's the way they talk to one another at school, and that's the way they touch one another at school. And then I'm the one that gets charged with discrimination because I'm telling them you have to follow different rules when you come to the employment place. And I think that's a very valid point. And so I think schools are just absolutely crucial in working with people to just that idea of treating one another respectfully all the time. And that is so absolutely crucial to get that message across however you can. And then it moves into other parts of our life.
Our commission has really taken a focus on employment-related complaints in the workplace. That's where we really decided to target our work. So we haven't focused on the school. There are so many good organizations. Pamela Dos Ramos is here, and her organization, the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Center, does some tremendous work with going out to the schools and working with those students, and there are many others. Alberta has had for a number of years a provincial initiative called Safe and Caring Schools and Communities, and where the focus has been a real partnership between the Department of Learning and the school system and the community to build knowledge and skills and understanding in a very integrated way. So there is really excellent work that's being done out there. In terms of our mandate, we're really responding. And again, it really comes down to what we were talking about earlier, that the numbers drive the work. And so one of the numbers that we deal with is 80% of complaints in the area of employment, and that's a huge number. So that's where we focus. On a personal note, some of us have been through simulation training. I've been through it personally in the disability area. It's incredibly powerful work.
Well, I think that's another area where a private foundation might be able to acquire some monies and follow a creative idea like that, in which you sponsored perhaps a walk in each other's moccasins week or something in the way of assimilation training. It's a very, very worthwhile concept to open people's eyes to what the other person is facing.
I would just add that there's good news is the grants around the country now. I've been working with the Post Falls School District, and I believe they're going to receive a 3-year grant. And I am as strong an advocate as you'll ever find for simulations and role playing, because you're so correct that when you are not in your shoes with someone else and know what that feels like, it really can make a change in behavior. And so that's a real movement in that direction. At the higher education level, we do a lot of that. I've always been a very strong advocate of that. So it's gaining momentum. And the gentleman back here had a question earlier.
Yeah, I was wondering what kind of protection there is against harassment for Caucasian males under 30.
The question is, what kind of protection is there for Caucasian males under 30?
Under our statute, you are protected against harassment based on your race, based on your gender. You are not protected against harassment based on your age until you get to be 40. But you have the very same protection against those other two things, the same way as a minority person or a woman would.
So off-color comments don't fall into either of those categories? It has nothing to do with race, age, gender, ethnicity, anything like that?
Well, when you talk about off-color, what we would have to do is talk more specifically about exactly what you mean. You're getting into possibly the area of sexual harassment. And the law in Idaho protects people against sexual harassment if it gets to a certain level of offensiveness, and that's what we would probably have to talk about to see. It certainly does not protect people from every off-color comment that's going to be made in the workplace. But when those kinds of comments get egregious enough that it's making it difficult for the person to go to work and to enjoy their job and to do what they're supposed to be doing, so it's really interfering with your ability to do your job, then that's what we call a hostile work environment, and you are protected against that kind of harassment.
So specifically what I'm thinking is like degrading name calling from the owner of the company, things like that, consistent every day.
Well, again, it depends on if it's degrading name calling based on race, for example, or maybe sexual terms. Either of those you would be protected against if that had become offensive enough to you that it was really interfering with your ability to enjoy, to go do that job and do what you're supposed to be doing. You would be protected against that.
Canada, is there anything about Canada?
Well, in Alberta, you would be protected on more grounds than you would be, I think, based on what I've understood in Idaho, because we have a wider number. We have 13 grounds that are protected, and that includes things like sexual orientation, your marital status, your family status, etc. In the area of employment, we our statute allows for protection 18 years of age and older, and so if you're under 18, you're not protected on the basis of age, but you're protected on all other grounds, and if you're over 18, you're protected on all grounds. What this gentleman seemed, I wondered whether he was talking about simply, as you said, more of a hostile work environment. You know, we get a number of calls from people who work in an environment which is disrespectful, degrading. There's name calling, and it's not that it's possible to single out what happens in relation to a particular ground. It's just a poorly managed organization where those values are not inculcated and communicated and practiced and modeled. And our legislation does not allow us to deal with that. When we get those kinds of calls, we can talk with a caller and we can refer them elsewhere. But it's at this point in time, the fact that it's a poisoned organizational environment, if it's not related to any of those grounds, it's an incredibly difficult situation, but it's not protected under our human rights legislation.
On that note, they had to go do a TV show. We have to stay on time. It's really a tight schedule today. And I want to have about 5 minutes say hi to you as you leave, but let's thank them for coming, and we have to go do TV with them. Thank you.
I've got a question. I have waited here for an hour and a half, and I have a question. Mr. Delgadillo, yes. I made a complaint to you last year at the University of Idaho, University of California Irvine basketball game, where the song "Play That Funky Music, White Boy," which is a racial slur, was played at halftime at the basketball game, and you didn't do anything about it, sir. And Miss at the Idaho Human Rights Commission, now I know who to go to, because here we have a group of people who are spouting platitudes about human rights, but you, sir, did not address me with respect. I am a hate crime victim from California. I was shot in the face during the zebra killings in 1975. And I am also the Idaho representative for the European American Unity and Rights Organization. We are concerned about the human rights, civil rights of European American people. We are the people that are called Goy, Gringo, Honky, White Boy, and Shiksa. And we will want feedback from your community, and we want outreach to our community to help us with the problems that we have. Like European American girls have the lowest self-esteem of any other group in society, but we don't see your organization targeting the European American community other than to racially profile us with the fact that we are the perpetrators of this, that, and the other. In fact, most people that live in this community are refugees, European American refugees from California. So we are immigrants, as the local newspaper said. We need to be treated with respect, and we need popcorn forums that have people like me who have lots of information that most people do not have, to be able to hear what we have to say about what's going on in our richly textured community as European Americans or European Canadians. That's it. What I am, I wrote the resolution for European American Heritage Month for October in California. It got passed in California by the California State Legislature and approved by the governor. But because I've been so demonized, it was never passed again. And it was only a resolution. It was not binding. It never got into the schools. What we want is our own Heritage Month for kids.
So you spoke with some of the men at the University of Idaho then?
Yeah, he was a